going on, guys? It's Cimo. So yesterday I showed you guys a combo tutorial for the Pendulum Magician FTK that rose from the aftermath of YCS Atlanta. And the interesting thing is that FTKs became the epicenter of debate amongst the community as to whether or not FTKs should exist in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because FTKs have existed for quite some time, but a lot of people are arguing, is enough, and should FTKs really exist at this point in the game's lifespan? So that's what we're going to discuss today. What I want to do is I want to argue both sides of the argument for and against FTKs, and then I'll inject my own opinions at the end of the discussion. But before we get into that, I want to give a big shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Carlos. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So for the 0.1% of you who don't know what an FTK is, FTK stands for first turn kill. This is essentially a series of moves or a combo that's going to get your opponent's life points from 8,000 to 0 before they even have the opportunity to take a single turn, or you're going to win through some sort of alternate win condition like Exodia. And FTKs have existed in this game for so long. I would know because I've played this game since the game's inception. We've had to deal with stuff like Magical Scientist FTK, Butterfly Dagger ELMA FTK, there's Frog FTK, I could just keep going on and on. There's Exodia FTK variants, Magical Explosion FTKs. There's a ton of degenerate FTKs we've had to deal with in this game's lifespan. And if you look at the Forbidden and Limitless and you see a card on there that's kind of obscure and you're wondering why the hell is this card on the list, it's probably a part of some stupid FTK and has basically existed on the list since that FTK was wiped off the face of the planet. But the thing is, FTKs still exist in today's game. Now, after YCS Atlanta, I actually ran a couple of polls both on YouTube and Facebook to see and kind of gauge whether or not the community feels that FTKs should be a part of the game. Because I have my own opinions, but I wanted to go into this blind and really see how the community feels, so I asked them to support their arguments as well. And not really surprisingly, I'd say about 2/3 of the people who decided to partake in these surveys decided that FTK should not be a part of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! However, what I found surprising is that there was actually a fair amount of players who feel that FTKs should be a part of the game, and I found that really fascinating, and so that's why I want to explore their reasoning first and discuss the arguments for FTKs existing in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So the first argument that is made is that FTK strategies are typically rogue strategies that aren't really meta, and it's something that isn't really going to be coming up too often, so it's not something that really needs to be put in check. Now, if you think about it, when you're going to a regional or a YCS, FTK strategies, for the most part, are something that you don't really have to think about all that much. When you're thinking about the meta, you're seeing the decks that have done consistently well across multiple events, the decks that have solidified themselves as the best decks of the format, and those traditionally, or at least historically, aren't really necessarily FTK decks. There's been very few instances where that is the case, so I guess that's a fair point. You know, if you're going into one of these events and you're playing an FTK deck, it's usually some very obscure combo, and you're probably going to just be able to steal some wins because your opponent might not be familiar with what you're doing, and you might just be able to get wins just straight from that alone. So people make the argument that it's kind of good to keep the meta players on their toes because it's something that can just come out of nowhere and just basically end their tournament record because it was something that they weren't prepared for. And I guess that's a somewhat valid argument because I guess it kind of allows people to get creative with the game, and if that's a way that they find to win, and I guess it works to some extent, then I guess, okay, I guess that's a somewhat reasonable argument. That leads us into the second argument. The players who are proponents of FTKs argue that FTKs are very typically glass cannon style decks. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, basically, these FTK decks, and especially FTK decks of the past, are decks that are basically one-trick ponies and don't really do anything other than trying to fulfill their win condition of their FTK. Take, for instance, something like the Exodia FTK decks of history's past. Basically, these decks are just trying to assemble all 5 pieces of Exodia in their hand, and if they do, they win. But if they don't, they're basically playing like 30-something spell cards, the 5 pieces of Exodia, and maybe like some Blue Eyes monsters that help facilitate cards like Cards of Consonance and Trade-In, just to help them turbo through their deck a lot faster, but they're not going to be winning with those cards. They're trying to get the 5 pieces of Exodia, and that's how the deck wins. But if the deck can't fulfill that win condition, it literally will not be able to do anything else. This is where a card like One Day of Peace came in, and why it's also on the Forbidden Limited list now, is because it basically gave decks like Exodia FTK, or I guess Exodia OTK as well, basically 3 whole turns to fulfill their win condition and get all 5 pieces of Exodia, since neither player would take damage under One Day of Peace. Now that's a really interesting way to go about it, and by saying the fact that these decks don't really have any other alternate win condition, it kind of gives any good competitive deck that would actually have a traditional means of winning the game, it already has an inherent advantage, because as soon as that player either messes up part of their combo, doesn't have the correct combo pieces, or anything else just goes wrong, the deck has 0 chance of winning, and it doesn't matter really what you're playing, as long as you're playing something that can just inflict damage to your opponent flat out, you're gonna win the game outright, assuming one of those 3 things goes wrong. Now this gets us into our third argument, and that's the fact that hand traps exist in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And are basically staple in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! At that. Back in the day, you guys have to remember that hand traps didn't really exist. Like, Effect Veiler came out around the time of Frog FTK, but that was like it. Back when Magical Scientist FTK was out, back when ELMA FTK, all these other FTKs existed, if your opponent could pull it off, you had no way to disrupt them during your opponent's turn. And I guess Hanewada existed during Frog FTK as well, but again, it's one of those cards where it's like, are you really going to play that if you really need to win? If the meta, which at the time Frog FTK was just completely universal across the format, then yeah, okay, that might be justified, but at the same time, you have to realize now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! We have Ash Blossom, we have Ghost Ogre, Effect Veiler, Gamma, Reaper. There's so many hand traps that we have that have the opportunity to disrupt our opponent's plays that a lot of these FTK decks can be rather fragile, and basically just by hitting the right card with one hand trap, it can completely disrupt the strategy. The FTK is going to be broken, and since going off the second point and assuming that these decks are glass cannons, if we disrupt the combo, we should be able to win the game outright from there. So FTK proponents are basically going off of those 3 arguments, and that's basically their reasoning for why FTKs should exist in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! However, I'm going to go ahead and walk to the other side and go with the opponents of FTKs, and I'm going to go ahead and argue the same points, but for the opponents of FTKs. So the first point was the fact that FTKs are typically rogue strategies. Well, as we see here with the Pendulum Magician FTK, I wouldn't consider the Pendulum Magician FTK a rogue strategy, because Pendulum Magicians, at least at the time of recording this video, have solidified themselves as the strongest deck of the format. Now the thing is, you have the strongest deck of the format that's able to incorporate an FTK into it, so it's not necessarily this rogue deck anymore. You already have the most represented deck of the competitive format that now has an FTK built into it as well. This isn't something that's rogue. This is now something that has become meta, and you're basically going to be seeing this several times throughout a single tournament, and that's not exactly healthy for a competitive environment. That moves on to the second point, which is where FTKs are traditionally glass cannon decks. Well, again, referencing Pendulum Magician now has an FTK, but even if that FTK gets disrupted and it can't go through, Pendulum Magicians are still very capable of producing insane boards with multiple negations that are going to prevent your opponent from playing the game, and is going to pretty much just ultimately win you the game outright as a whole, depending on the rest of their 5-card hand. And the fact that other traditional decks that have been FTKs in the past don't really have other win conditions is kind of contradictory to that point, because now we have a deck that is perfectly capable of doing what it can, but now it has an FTK involved as well. So if you know your opponent doesn't have those hand traps based on how they're playing, you know that if you go for that FTK, you basically just solidified yourself a win, and it wasn't really exactly a good win at that. There's also a deck like Gem Knight FTK at the moment, which I would say falls in the rogue category, so it kind of doesn't exactly fall in, it doesn't follow suit there. But the thing is, the Gem Knight FTK also has an alternate win condition as well, because if you don't pull off the FTK, Gem Knights are just gonna assemble a ton of really big high attack monsters and can just beat over everything and kill you with a ton of damage. So it's a deck that can still perform even if the FTK gets stopped. And speaking of the FTK getting stopped, that gets us into our third point, which is the fact of hand traps. Now, obviously FTK players argue that hand traps disrupt the FTKs, but at the same time, if you have multiple hand traps, sometimes against these FTKs, that isn't even enough. Gem Knight FTK can very easily play through multiple hand traps in several instances, and Pendulum Magician FTK can also do the same depending on when the hand traps are used. And so the thing is, but I think the more root cause here is the fact that if I'm playing a game, I shouldn't have to hope that I open one of my hand traps if I'm playing against an FTK deck, in the fact that I can actually stop the FTK so that I actually get to play Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't really think that's exactly a fair notion that, oh, someone's playing this FTK deck, and because I didn't open one of my hand traps to stop the FTK, I'm just gonna fucking lose. I don't really exactly think that makes for a fun game. And that kind of leads into my final points, which are, you know, players, especially on the competitive level, pay hundreds if not thousands of dollars a year to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Competitively across the country. And the thing you have to realize is the fact that you're paying all this money to go play in an event, and then you happen to not draw one of your hand traps against someone playing an FTK deck, and you just happen to lose because of that. Yu-Gi-Oh! is supposed to be a game of interaction with your opponent. At that point with FTK decks, you're basically just playing a game of solitaire and getting wins like that. And that isn't exactly fun. The whole fun of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that you have an opponent that you can interact with. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has some of the most interaction of any card game on the market, and I think that's what makes it so appealing. The fact that there's so many different things you can do, not only on your turn, but your opponent's turn as well, is what makes the game so fun, and what really kind of just embodies the competitive mentality, because there's so many different ways to go about it, and there's so much that you can do. I really think that FTK decks are unhealthy for that reason. So guys, those are just my thoughts when it comes to FTK decks. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think, and which side of the argument are you on? Do you think FTK should exist in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Or do you think they have no place and should just be flat out banned? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.